So let me first invite our first moderator of this morning's session is Ms. Gauri Singh, who is the Director of Country Support and Partnerships at IRENA, to the stage, and I'll invite my, my other panelists to join her as well. First session, Developing Markets for Renewable Energy-Based Mini-Grids, Insights into Policy and Regulatory Aspects. A brief note on our moderator. As I said, Ms. Gauri Singh, my colleague, is the Director of Country Support and Partnerships at IRENA. Since 2007, Ms. Singh has been Joint Secretary in India's Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. Her responsibilities include all policy formulation and international cooperation. And I will leave Gauri to take the floor now. Thank you.
Check.
So good morning and welcome to the second day of IOREC. After some extremely engaging and I would say very fruitful discussions yesterday on the standalone systems, I think the time is now to change track and move into mini grids. And we would have today 2 sessions exclusively dedicated to mini grids, and I think that ever since SC for All and IEA came up with reports on the fact that by 2030, nearly 40% of the power would be supplied based on mini grids. It has generated a lot of excitement, and there's very engaged discussions in forums like this on the possibilities of how this sector could move forward. But even while we had these discussions in forums like these, there has been in I think the last 3-4 years a legion of entrepreneurs that have moved on the ground. They've done pilots. They're looking at taking forward expansion plans, and that's what's making this whole segment extremely exciting. So I have with me a very distinguished panel, and I will start by introducing from my extreme right, Mr. Li from the Hangzhou Regional Small Hydro Center in China has been working in this field of small hydropower development and has experience both in the policy and regulatory aspects, but also in the framing of public-private participation in the small hydro sector. Then I have Mr. Navraj, who comes from Nepal. He works in the Alternate Energy Promotion Center, and his responsibilities include biomass and energy efficiency, but he has a lot of interest. It takes a lot of interest in the small hydro community-driven mini grids, and I'm sure he'll talk to us about that. Brian, to my right, is an entrepreneur. He's also a development advocate. He's co-founded Mera Gaon Power in 2010 and works in some of the most challenging areas in UP to bring lighting to some of the off-grid hamlets, and has been looking at developing affordable solutions for doing so, but also developing processes that can make a self-managed unit efficient, which I guess has enabled him to scale up in a very short time from one village in 2011 to now almost 1,200 villages. So it's been, I guess, quite a journey for him, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about how he's managed to do that. I have Rana on my left. Rana is based in Paris in the REN 21 network, and she actually coordinates a very well-known report, which I guess all of us in the room know of, the global status report for the REN 21, and the latest edition has just been launched this month. So she also has experience in the private sector and applied research in energy access and renewables, so I'm sure we'll get to learn much more from her when we take the discussions forward. And then, of course, we have Nico, who is the co-founder and the managing director of Inensis, works in Senegal, but now he's expanded his work and is now consulting on mini grids with the ADB. And he likes to call the Inensis as the one-stop shop for mini grid operators. So looking at both the business models and also engineering aspects of mini grids. And incidentally, I didn't know, but I happened to visit one of his mini grids in Senegal, which is probably one of the first that was in operation in all of West Africa. So we do have this very good mix of both entrepreneurs on the ground and practitioners and policymakers, and I hope we can get them engaged in discussions and also the audience into a discussion that can lead us into some good outcomes at the end of the session. So let me start by inviting the panelists to maybe spend 5-7 minutes on giving a broad overview on what they do and what's their experience in this sector and where do they think this segment is going. So can I start with you, Mr. Lee?
Good morning. I'm from China, the Hangzhou Regional Center for Small Hydropower. The Hangzhou Regional Center is jointly established by the UNDP and the Chinese government in 1981. And the main target of the center is for the technical exchange in the field of the small hydropower, in the form of holding the training workshop for the professionals. So there are over 1,200 participants from the over 60 developing countries to join the training workshop, in which over 20 from Philippines. And as to the small hydropower, the great development of the small hydropower in China. Totally there are 45,000 small hydropower stations built with the total installed capacity of 69 gigawatt for the small hydropower station. And for the definition of the small hydropower station changed with the development of the national economy. In 1960s, below 6 megawatt is the small hydropower station. And then in 1970s, 12 megawatt. In 1980s, 25 megawatt. And after 1990s, the small hydropower up to 50 megawatt in China. So as to the development for the small hydropower station and the rural electrification, the SHP contribute a lot for the rural electrification. The Chinese government launched the rural electrification in 1980s. So totally 654 county rural electrification have been built between 1980s to 2000. So, so there are many mini grids built at that time, and one power station or 2 or 3 power stations to form a mini grid to power supply for the township or for the whole county. So in 1980s, the access to the electricity rate about 40% in 1980 in the area of 1980s, and by the end of the last 2011, the access rate to electricity reached to 99.7%. It's very high. And the last 5 million people, the last 5 will be powered within coming 2 years, according to the central government, the planning of the. So for the mini grids, there are still 417 mini grids existing in the very extremely remote area. So the mini grid, and for the SHP, the grading, so for all the preferential policies should be for the small hydro project also will be shared by the grid, for suitable by the grid, such as the lower VAT, lower VAT 6% and other preferential policies for the small hydro project. Okay, that's all I think.
Thank you. I think that was a very good introduction, and I think the startling data that you presented of 99.7% electrification in China, and you still have almost 400 mini grids still operating. So I think later in the discussion we'll come back to what is the policy regarding those mini grids. But let me turn to Navraj now, who will probably also talk about small hydro mini grids, but in a very different context.
Thank you, Gauri. Very good morning. Thank you for the introduction as well. So I will start with Nepal and the Nepalese context directly. I represent Alternative Energy Promotion Center in Nepal, which is a focal agency of the government of Nepal for the promotion and development of renewable energy technologies in the country. We are under the Ministry of Science, Technology and Environment. And we have been promoting technologies which are in the we supply electricity in the off-grid areas, plus cleaner cooking technologies like biogas and improved cook stoves. For the electrification in off-grid areas, there are small and mini hydro, solar PV systems, biomass gasification systems, and wind energy systems. Basically, talking about the off-grid electricity, let me first put the overall electrification context of the country. According to recent census data, only 74% of the households in the country are supplied with the electricity, out of which 14% comes from the off-grid sources like micro mini hydro and solar home systems. But the variation is data also exists. For example, the old development indicator shows that only 53% of the households have electricity access, out of which 12% comes from the off-grid sources. So it shows off-grid sources have very good contribution. And in the recent years, access to electricity is being promoted in an accelerated way through off-grid sources. We have micro, mini, and small hydro projects basically growing very fast, and the government's policy is very much supportive towards that growth. But the thing is, those projects is a stand-alone system. They got very good recognition and very good support, and they are working well. But when it comes to connecting those projects into national grid, there is certain issue. Probably we'll talk about this in the latter part. The micro, mini, and pico hydro technologies that we are promoting are being subsidized partially by the government, and that is as per the renewable energy subsidy policy of the government. Broadly, that policy defines subsidy loan equity ratio in range 40-40-20. So basically, government subsidy covers 40% of the project cost. 40% comes through loan or through the developer, and 20% is a minimum requirement of equity. And those projects are either owned by the community as a user group or owned by individual entrepreneur who takes community in confidence through the formation of user group, and the developer, they negotiate about the price, the tariff. So we are not dictating tariff of those off-grid systems. So if those projects are feasible or possible to be connected in the grid, in that case, the power purchase agreement is done between the developer and the grid operator, that is NEA, Nepal Electricity Authority. And there is one more thing related with the licensing of the project that I also want to share with you. There is a separate department of the government under the Ministry of Energy called Department of Electricity Development, who deals with the licensing. So according to the licensing regulation, projects with capacity 100 kilowatt and above come within the range of the licensing rule. But the projects below 100 kilowatt, they don't need licensing, but there is a small committee called Water Resources Committee in the local government body, District Development Committee, that deals with the water right for that small size range of the projects. And AEPC is dealing with the projects up to 1 megawatt, providing subsidy plus technical assistance as per the government's subsidy policy. But within the AEPC's scope, we can provide technical assistance for projects up to the size 10 megawatt. So that's how the roles and responsibilities have been divided. And in the recent years, because of the acute shortage of power and long hours of load shedding, this phenomenon of installing solar PV systems even in the grid-served areas is also growing. And people are trying to push the government to provide subsidy even for those systems. So far, government subsidy is only for the areas which are not served by the grid, but there is a growing push to subsidize the connection of solar PV systems and other small-scale renewable energy sources, even in the grid-served area. So I think I will stop here.
No, thank you. And I think we've heard some interesting perspectives from both China and from Nepal. So maybe time to hear ground up perspective from an entrepreneur. Brian?
Well, thank you for coming this morning. I know it's the first session of the day, so it might be a little painful, but we'll try to keep it entertaining for everybody. My company, Miragaon Power, we operate in rural Uttar Pradesh in northern India, and we're a lighting company. This is the first distinction that I think is important, especially as we get through the debate today on tariffs and regulations. So what Miragaon provides is 2 lights and a mobile phone charger, 7 hours a day, 7 days a week. We currently have a customer base of just over 20,000 households that we've achieved in 2.5 years. Again, why lighting? So, it's batteries. Oh, here we go. So why lighting? Well, early on in our market research, we quickly honed in that over 20 million households in UP depend on kerosene as their primary lighting source. So we see kerosene very much as our competition. As such, even where there's grid available, kerosene will still be the primary lighting source for those households. So recently, in the last several months, we've seen that on-grid villages have sought our systems as well. So to tell you a little bit about how our system works, we don't do much marketing. We started with one village in 2011, and that village quickly turned to 5 within a few weeks, just based on what the villagers had seen nearby. Typically how it works, our team will come in about 8:30 in the morning, and 3 guys will install a village-wide system by the end of that day. Each house receives 2 80-lumen LEDs and a mobile phone charger. The community can choose when it likes its service to operate. So typically during the winter, it will be for 5 hours in the evening, 2 hours in the morning, and in summertime, it will be throughout the evening. We operate like an MFI. So it's a prepay system. We have a network of collectors that are responsible for X number of villages each day, and they use group formations and come on a given day each week to that village to collect the prepayment of 25 rupees. Now, 25 rupees is less than these households would currently pay for 3 hours of kerosene light a night at about 10 lumens per lamp and their mobile phone charging needs. We estimate that we're saving our customers between 30 and 60 rupees per month on their existing energy needs. Default is not a huge issue with us, but we have experienced it, and so we have a very strict policy of if you don't pay, you have a 1-week grace period, and if you don't pay after that, disconnection can occur. We can disconnect a house in a few minutes, and we can remove an entire village system within an hour. That system will then be redeployed to a new installation the next working day. So we very much make sure our assets are constantly generating our return on our investment. A little bit about the context of where we operate. So we're not a pan-Indian company, and very much for the service we provide at the moment, I don't feel all of India is our market. We're really slated to a few states in the north and the northeast, and UP, for anybody that knows UP, is a large enough market to keep any business going for 20 years. The UP context, it's a state of about 140 million people, of which 108 million are off-grid, and then of that, 21 million households are off-grid. So we currently serve 0.1% of that off-grid population. Our typical community may not even have a brick house. It will be a village of between 40 and 100 houses. That's considered a habitation under census data. And most of those will be mud and thatch, though we do require a brick house to install our system in. Our typical customer earns less than $1 a day, and primary activity will be agriculture. If you visit our customers' houses, you don't see grinders, you don't see chillers, you don't find television sets. Often there'll be one mobile phone, and that won't even have talk credit on it. The phones are simply used for entertainment purposes. Incomes vary, and they're seasonal. So income's very dependent on what the weather is like and the crops are of that time. The benefits we've seen, the first one is when you go into a typical village in Sitapur, where we operate, before our system is there, everybody's asleep and in their houses by 8 o'clock at night. Now, once the system comes, you hear a buzz. Everybody puts a light outside, and there's always a light put in the kitchen. So our customers have given us a feedback that they feel more secure. And in fact, one story we were told, one of our customers, the day before our service arrived, somebody had walked into her house at night while she was in the same room and stole 5 liters of her mint oil, which is one of the primary crops during this time of year. And she had said that if that light was there, they wouldn't have been able to come in and steal it. And so we've been told that there's been a decrease in crime in our villages. And in fact, often the request for all-night light is so that it could be used for security. Micro enterprises have begun to pop up. So we see sari embroidery that used to only be able to be done during the day because kerosene was insufficient for it. Now we see sari embroiderers popping up in a number of villages. And in fact, where they may have done 1 sari in an evening, they're doing 2 or 3, and they're employing other local women from the community. Bag manufacturing for market, so jute bags. We see a lot of jute bag production. Tailors are operating in the evening. Women are sorting their crops for market for the next day. So although we're not providing productive power in the sense of mechanical power, there is increased productivity and increased benefits of local incomes because of our service. Another added benefit of MGP is that we're a local employer. So we currently have 120 staff across 8 offices of operation, and only 5 of those come from outside the areas we operate in. So the 95% of our staff come from the communities we serve. We train our staff as trainee technicians, and we have 12 managers now that are running offices and teams of their own that started as trainee technicians. We're training them in professionalism, leadership. We're giving them basic computing skills so they can manage our internal MIS on a daily basis. And we pay far above minimum wage. We've started offering health benefits to all of our employees as well as to their families. So in addition to the lighting impact, there has been this employment impact, and MGP is now seen as a company people want to work for from that area. It's still very difficult to retain anybody from outside the area to live there. So where do we go from here? Our priority is to start working with mobile payments, which have not really taken up in India yet, but if you look at Bangladesh, if you look particularly in East Africa, where mobile payments have been the backbone to energy services, as we have a critical mass of customers, we would like to now start working with the teleco on piloting a mobile payment activity. And the next knock-on would then be able to offer some financial inclusion packages. Banking is another thing that's missing from our customers. There'll often be a Garmin bank around, but it doesn't open its doors. If it's open, somebody doesn't want to do the transaction. So we've been asked, particularly by the wives of our employees, to set up savings accounts for them and garnish a portion of their wages to keep in a savings account. So we do see the demand for financial services. As a last mile operator, health is another area we're looking at. So we're trialing a mobile health service at the moment with our insurance provider, and then we'll be looking at selling that insurance to our communities as well. And then education is something we'd like to look at. We have the ability to power workstations in schools, which would provide internet access and tablet access to children during the day. But then the flip side is we can provide lights in the evening and do adult education. In particular, looking at agricultural extension and also access to health information. And then moving forward, we're looking at some products like solar home systems that would hit a niche area of our market where they want more than lighting, or because of their economic and social standing, they feel they should have more than a mini-grid connection. So these are areas that we're looking at in the future, but for the time being, we're really focusing on our core product and building our market. Thank you.
Thank you, Ran. I think you've defined anchor loads very differently in your own business model by bringing in more of the rural marketing aspect, which allows you to go into your customer base that you're building. So I think we'll come back to it. And Rana, you'd like to give us a broader, more global overview?
Thank you, Gauri. So, as Gary mentioned, I'm working for REN21, which is a multi-stakeholder network on renewable energy. And those multi-stakeholders work together to advance the global transition towards renewable energies. So why are we looking into renewable energy mini-grids or hybrid mini-grids? There are two reasons. As mentioned, we are producing this Renewables Global Stats report, which has a specific section on distributed renewable energy in developing countries. And since something like 2 to 3 years, we really see a huge dynamics here. Not only grassroots projects taking place, but also a great attention given by international players as well, I mean, in the development world, but also from businesses and so on. So that's really something we can see. However, we can also see that it's very, very complicated to have a real good understanding of what is really out there. So what are the installed capacities of mini-grids? There is not really a lot of consolidated information, and that's a motivation for us to look into that topic in one of our mainstream activities. Another reason why we're looking into this is we're talking here about mini-grids because of the energy access objective. But mini-grids also allow to contribute actually to meeting the other sustainable energy for all objectives, especially also the one on doubling the renewable energy share. Why is that? So lots of us know we have diesel mini-grids. Today, hybrid mini-grids and renewable mini-grids are very often already competitive. A main challenge is still existing with regard to high upfront costs, but theoretically there is a huge potential. Another reason why renewable energy and hybrid mini-grids helps to develop and deploy renewable energy is because they are contributing to develop power infrastructures and power market structures which already allow for distributed renewable energy generation, which is grid connected in the future. And this is something which is really important when we are talking about the potential of mini-grids in developing countries. When you look into, here it's interesting to look into what happens in industrialized countries with a high penetration of renewable energy. Today they really face main challenges, and there is a need to restructure power markets and infrastructures. And this is an opportunity for developing countries which still need to establish the infrastructure to do it right from the beginning on and allow for distributed generation, distributed distribution systems and transmission systems, but also the possibility of independent power providers and micro-utilities. So this is another reason why we are looking into mini-grids. And coming from a policy network, unfortunately, I mean, everybody here in the room probably knows about the great potential of mini-grids, but very often when you're going to some of the more policymaker-driven forums in the developing countries, there is still a lot of countries where a very conventional idea of rural electrification exists, which means grid extension at any cost and isolated system, isolated renewable energy system. So there is a need to raise the awareness for the potential of mini-grids. And together, this was a motivation why REN21, together with the European Energy Initiative and the Alliance for Rural Electrification, is developing for the moment the mini-grid policy toolkit, which is specifically focusing on African decision makers to really raise the awareness for the potential, but also explain or show that there are different operator models existing, that it is necessary to establish a specific policy network, a specific regulatory environment to allow for a good and sustainable development of mini-grids. So that's the reason why we're looking into this. And just with regard to the status of mini-grids, I mean, what we can see in the Global Stats report, basically mini-grids exist since a long, long time. They are diesel-based. We see that there is a lot of grassroots activities, private companies, but there are also a lot of countries which really already started setting up policy frameworks which allow for a large-scale deployment of mini-grids. So, for instance, we heard a couple of examples here for Asia. When you're looking into Africa, for instance, there are Tanzania, Senegal, and Mali to mention, where there is a possibility to, in Tanzania, sorry, I'm looking just not to. In Senegal, for instance, they have a concessionary approach where there is a possibility to have concessions, large-scale concessions, where the concessionary will cover grid-connected, but also rural electrification. But there is also a possibility for micro-utilities or micro-concessionaries to receive subsidies based on mini-grids and mini-grid connections. And there is a very well-defined tariff scheme. And in Senegal, for instance, there are really numerous players who are out there who are doing mini-grids, and there are several hundred mini-grids already in the pipeline. So this is a good example to show that policy frameworks can really also contribute to policy development, market development.
Rana, I think you've brought this issue of diesel mini-grids, and I know there's many in the audience who have thoughts around how diesel mini-grids getting hybridized are probably the low-hanging fruits. But also the fact that there are a number of rural electrification policies in countries that don't even mention about the possibility of renewables being a possible solution for mini-grids. So if you look at how the rural electrification policies in a lot of countries are framed, they only talk about more and more of diesel-based mini-grids that need to serve the communities that are not served as yet. So in fact, I think it's while I get Nico to talk about Enensis, but I can also maybe get him to introduce as an entrepreneur what he thinks would be some of the key elements that a policy framework should have to to get mini-grids on the center stage and create a landscape for their upscaling. So maybe while you're introducing Enensis, you can then go on to do that.
Sure, thank you, Gauri. Actually, Rana just introduced the electrification options. There are, there is grid extension, as everybody knows, which is practiced all over the world. At the other end, there is individual standalone systems, solar home systems, and so on. And now we talk about mini-grids. And mini-grids is a very broad range. Actually, we've got nanogrids, which probably Brian is in this sector, nano to microgrids. Then we've got the microgrids, and then we've got the mini-grids. We rather come from the micro to mini-grid scale. Our systems are in between 20 kilowatts of power generation capacity up to several hundred kilowatts of power generation capacity. As Gauri already said, we started our activities in West Africa, in Senegal, where we installed a number of microgrids electrifying small villages with roughly 1,000 inhabitants per village, in roughly 80 to 100 households each, and developed a certain business model around that. We're now replicating this model in Tanzania in a slightly larger approach with larger villages. Electrification rate in Tanzania is around 15%, which leaves a lot of space for mini-grids even in larger villages. Beyond that, we offer a lot of consultancy services for GIZ, for ADB, for example, and support other mini-grid operators in African but also in Asian countries to become successful. We optimize, together with them, we optimize their economic performance, their implementation strategy, their operation and management strategy. So that is about Enensis. From an entrepreneur's perspective, in the like micro to small mini grid space. We think that some conditions have to be there for us to enter into a certain market, into a certain country. And that could be brought down to just 3 points, 3 very basic points, which is first, it must be legal to operate mini grids as a private operator in a certain market, first. Second, we must be able to charge cost-covering tariffs in that market. And I'm not too supportive of cross-subsidization because, well, from the government side, cross-subsidization of tariffs, because, well, I do not want to rely on like government money transfer to our bank account, which actually, from my experience, doesn't work very well in any country. And the third point is somehow we have to select villages. And selecting villages is an issue in many countries and many markets. If governments support us in selecting these villages, saying, okay, well, here's a village which is pretty large, which will not be connected to the main grid within the foreseeable future, let's say 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, this is a starting point for us. We can get to economies of scale quite quickly in one village. We don't need to take higher risks to go into several smaller villages as long as the government supports us to select the right villages, which are hopefully large, which are hopefully economically strong, with a good potential for productive use of electricity, because that is where our business model is based on. So let's stop here.
Thank you, Nico. But Nico, I mean, what's the kind of issue you're raising? Any good utility, any person who's worked in a utility will know that you're asking for the most confidential data and would never give it to you. I mean, I can imagine Brian can go, hitting his head on the wall of the utility in UP. He'll never get the data about when and where electrification will happen or how the grid extension plan will work. It's almost as if it's top secret. But let's get Brian to give us his experience on, dealing with the UP utility.
So thus far, we've had very little government engagement, both from the center in Delhi or in Lucknow. That's not for want of trying to engage government, but it seems very clear that there hasn't been a lot of interest in actually making action on the ground. With regards to UP, if you look at where we operate, it's not economical to string the lines out to those communities. The other is they wouldn't even have the ability to pay in some cases for a grid connection, nor perhaps be willing. The other fact of the matter is getting the grid in rural India does require other payments than are officially sanctioned. So it is an expensive endeavor for a customer. Now, we've been trying to engage UP government just very simply. We know they cannot get to certain areas, say within the next 5 years, 10 years, maybe 20 years in some cases. And our feeling is that we could much more efficiently operate if we knew areas that were going to be off-grid for the next 5 years. We could fill that gap temporarily for 5 years, for even 3 years our business model would allow, until the government does come. So the biggest help we would have would be simply give us some of that data. Show us a little bit. We don't need to know what's planned for the whole state. Just show us what's planned for one district.
Yeah, but as I said, this is this is data that any utility will guard with their life. They just won't part with it. And I think, as you've very correctly brought this out, how do we expect entrepreneurs to come into the setting of putting their business and taking risks if they don't know what they can plan for? So I think it's a very critical element in what the policy should have. But let me also get Navraj to maybe talk about his experience with how the grid extension has gone in Nepal and what it means for the mini grid operators.
Thank you, Gauri. Actually, grid extension, although we do have plans like 5-year plan or 10-year plan to have grid extension, but it does not work out that way. Some election is coming in, there is a political intervention, and in certain area where there is no plan, overnight there can be some erection of electricity poles. So this is common phenomena. So because of this haphazard extension of grid, it comes as a risk to existing or under construction micro mini hydro projects. Because once grid is there, the grid operator can buy back those projects and they can even dismantle. So far, the connection of micro mini hydro projects with the grid is not a priority, and we are trying hard to make it a kind of obligation and establish the rules and regulations required for this. But the grid operator is kind of hesitant to move in that line. They have particularly two issues related with this. One, it can invite technical and managerial problems. Technical problems due to poor quality of electricity being produced by the small systems, and managerial problems. And the second issue they are raising is when there is a shutdown or when there is a repair maintenance work, it can backfeed. The grid may backfeed to the small generators. So these are the two critical issues that we have been hearing. But one successful case that we have demonstrated is interconnection of mini grids. We have done one mini grid project. We still call it a mini grid, but it's an interconnection of 6 micro hydro projects located in a vicinity, where power produced from one project can be shared among the 6 and can go to the customer. So, and that has successfully operated. Our next plan is to connect that interconnection into the national grid, but we are not sure when it's going to happen. And one more thing that I mentioned to forget earlier, although that's not already in the plan, because of this acute power shortage in the urban areas, I was mentioning people are trying to have a small standalone system. But now there is a tremendous push to go for the grid-connected solar PV systems as well. So far we don't have those systems, but hopefully in the coming fiscal year, some of them will definitely come. Thank you.
So I think while there are a number of issues around policy and regulations that we could discuss, but what I'd really like to touch upon before really opening the floor to the audience is maybe get some more comments from the panelists on tariff setting, and also, you know, what are the kind of regulations that need to be in place for ensuring that if the grid does come to an area which is being operated by a mini grid operator, how does the interconnection happen, and whether there should be regulations around that. So let me actually turn back to Nico and also get you to maybe give your thoughts on how do you think, for an entrepreneur, what kind of a tariff structuring works best for you?
Well, if you have a look at cost structures of mini-grid companies, and tariffs actually should reflect cost structures in a certain way to minimize risks of the companies, you will find that most of the costs of a mini-grid company are fixed costs. Fixed cost means project development costs are fixed costs. Asset depreciation, debt, like interest on debt, or fixed costs. But, well, that is obvious. But actually what is not so obvious is that most operational costs are also fixed costs, head management costs, which is a big portion. the smaller the mini-grid gets, the smaller the company gets, the higher the portion of head management costs on the, as a percentage of the total costs. Local management costs, money collection, all fixed costs. It doesn't make a difference if you collect $1 per household per month or if you collect $500 per household per month. It's the same cost. Customer relationship management. The smaller the systems, the more you have to take care of the customers using the system properly, not connecting too high loads to bring the system to a breakdown. Use electricity efficiently. The smaller the system, usually the higher the tariffs also, and therefore the higher the cost to train local consumers of how to use electricity. Well, these are all fixed costs. And then there are some very limited variable costs, which is some maintenance costs and fuel. Not much more. And even if you go for renewables and try, even if you go for diesel gensets and try to reduce the fixed cost on that end, that doesn't change much because even in those systems, fuel cost is not the major, especially in small systems, is not the major cost, but it's rather the head management costs, the customer relationship management, all of that, which I just mentioned. And therefore, from a tariff point of view, this tariff should reflect the cost. If you have fixed income proportionally to your fixed costs, this means that you've got the minimum risk for the mini-grid operator. Well, then people might come up and say, okay, well, then maybe flat rate tariffs is the best you could do. But actually it's not, because with a flat rate tariff, you don't incentivize people to use energy efficiently. People keep their light burning throughout the day. They don't switch off their fans if they leave the room. So these kind of things happen. So, well, the flat rate tariff is not the answer. So actually what we as entrepreneurs would like to see and what we as entrepreneurs would like to encourage regulatory authorities to think about is tariffs that reflect the cost structure with a certain fixed component and a certain variable component.
I think that's very useful, and I'll just give another perspective. We were in Senegal in 2011 and doing the renewables readiness assessment, and we had an opportunity to go and see the mini-grid that Nico, you've helped develop with the GIZ. And it was very interesting because the regulations in Senegal provided for the regulatory commission to come in and set the tariff for any mini-grid operator anywhere in the country. Now, imagine a regulatory commission which is supposed to have around 5 members, but at any given point of time in the history, they didn't have more than 2 or 3 members, who anyway would be very busy setting tariffs for the larger power plants. And you tell them that you also need to look into these small 30 kilowatt, 40 kilowatt or sizes like that. And for the mini-grid operator to come to Dakar from wherever he or she is operating the mini-grid and make those continuous petitions for tariff, it can kill any system. I mean, so it has to be a framework also which allows, which now incidentally the Gambian law allows for. So they have a renewable energy law in Gambia which says that any mini-grid which is lower than, I think it's 250 kilowatt, which is charging tariffs at the rate of electricity that Gambia incidentally has around 50 cents per unit. So anything that's, any operator that's charging up to that need not even bother and can start operating. I know in Nepal, you do have a community system of the community sitting together and deciding tariffs. But Brian, let me come back to you, and maybe you can talk about how the tariff setting happens in your village, and is that something that you can work? Is that a system you can work with in the future, or you see some challenges?
So first of all, we have a fixed rate tariff across all of our customers and communities. One thing we found in the beginning was when we set the price of our tariff, again, we needed to look at what could we provide to a household where they're saving with their current energy expenditure. And that energy expenditure was for kerosene and mobile phone charging. So we come out about 30% less than they currently pay on that. One thing we learned very early on was not to inject any options in terms of the service that we provide or how it's delivered. So anytime that we overly consulted with a village on what it is they would like, what they should pay for it, it just created drag in terms of our project development process. So it was much easier to be very clear. You get 2 lights for this price. If you want 4 lights, you pay this much more. Everything's fixed. Now, if you look at currently where grid would be amongst our customer base, they're mostly below the poverty line. And UP has a fixed tariff of 120 rupees per month for power, and that's whether you receive it or not. So if you only have power 3 or 4 days a week, you're still paying the 120 rupees. So one thing I would say is look at the unit cost of that. The second is you still have other charges on top of that 120 rupees. You'll have your meter charge, you'll have your service, etc. So it goes above that. Now, we feel the best way to do it is what's a fixed tariff across a particular area where incomes will be the same, and they're getting a better deal than they currently get. When we talk about subsidies, power is subsidized in India and kerosene is subsidized in India. And immediately people will hone in on the off-grid operators and say, what is your unit cost? You know, it's excessive. But I say, what is the unit cost of kerosene? I mean, what would 1 unit of kerosene cost equivalent with or without the subsidy? So we do feel we're giving a better deal. And the hardest thing for us would be to be regulated in this way. It would just increase our costs across the board, which would mean we would be loss-making at that stage. So we're not pro-regulating the tariff at our size. I think when you get grid integration and the such, then it makes much more sense. But overall, the subsidy structure, both for kerosene and for the grid in India, does need to be looked at closely also.
No, I think you've raised this very important point of creating a level playing field between the off-grid, mini-grid operators and the grid-connected ones. And Rana, you'd like to come in with some comments on tariffs and subsidies and the interface of those?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, you exactly said what I thought. It's a question of creating a level playing field. Of fossil fuel and renewables, of mini-grid and grid extension. And with regard to this, I think the tariff structure is really, I mean, also linking the tariff structure back to the interconnection. Very often the tariff structure is not that critical. I mean, obviously it's critical because it needs to still be adapted to what the target group can pay. But it becomes very critical when the grid arrives with a lower tariff. Often with worse quality of grid connection, but there is a lot of awareness raising necessary on the customer's basis to just really see that the tariff and the quality of energy service they are receiving in the mini-grid is really worth it. And it's more challenging when the alternative would be to have to pay a very low price with regard to this. So also to link back to the question on what happens when the grid arrives and the need for, I mean, I understand that very often the companies say we do not want over-regulation, and I think this is something which is really very crucial because over-regulation can kill a business model. However, it is necessary to plan for, in a policy and regulative framework, to plan for some critical moments. One moment is obviously when the grid arrives, what happens to the assets? Is there a possibility of grid connection to establish standards which will allow for connecting the mini-grid to the main grid? Is there a possibility of feed-in tariffs? What are the tariff structures of grid-connected electricity in those areas and mini-grid electricity? I'm not saying that we need uniform tariffs, but it's something which needs to be planned so that the business model can really continue and survive on a sustainable way. And yeah, that's basically it.
Navraji, I think you wanted to speak something on community-based tariffs.
Thank you. Coming to this tariff discussion, yes, I agree with my fellow panelists that sustainable operation of projects should be the centerpiece while deciding the tariff structure, and that's what we are following. But still, what we are trying to is it's not. Let's not dictate the same tariff rate for everywhere, because there are few things. For example, in most of our micro mini hydro projects, the power factor is very low because they are considered as a means of lighting mostly. So we are trying to make efforts to increase the power factor so that in the daytime when there is electricity surplus, they can use for other productive uses and business purposes. That helps to improve the income of the project. The house-to-house metering is not yet in practice. We do have energy meter at source because of the CDM purpose also, because the small and micro hydro projects in Nepal qualify for the CDM. And how much energy is being generated, we measure only at source. Once that leaves the source, then it's again based on the per unit connected to the households. I mean the watt connected to the households. And one more point that we use as a reference that I want to share with you is we try to advocate for at least 20% of the total income should be set aside for the major repair and maintenance of the project. And from the rest 80%, they should cover the operation cost, plus if they are also willing to divide certain dividend, that should also come within that 80%. 20% should go into the major maintenance fund. So that's what we are trying to promote as a thumb rule, and it's helping. Thank you.
I think we've covered some aspects of tariff, and I think I will not be doing my duty as a moderator if I don't at least initiate some comments on grid interconnections. So maybe I can get Mr. Lee to just tell us very briefly on how these mini grids that were operating in China and what has been the policy to interconnect them, and then also get Nico to possibly give us some options before opening the floor to the audience then.
As I said, there are still around 400 mini grids existing operating in China. Actually, the mini grid is relatively isolated operate. The mini grid connected to the national grid, but the operation model is independently. So when during the rainy season, the surplus power will feed in the national grid. But during the dry season, the deficit power will be bought from the national grid. So the problem is the prices is different. The prices are different. During the surplus power, only half prices of that of the dry season, the power from the national grid. So that's the impair for the local power company. So, but anyway, they can exchange in power to ensure the normal uses for the local people by the help of the national grid. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. And I think he was just talking to me about how China has the law now for renewable energy producers, that even if you're producing 10 kilowatts and it's renewable energy, you have to, by law, be permitted to connect to the grid. So probably that's a very progressive regulation. Nico, maybe you can add a bit on the grid interconnection options, and then we'll open it.
Yeah, right. I would just like to introduce what options from an entrepreneur's point of view you have to connect the main grid to the mini grid. Actually, well, there are some options which are in practice already, and there are some options which are not. One option that is in practice is the, well, concession. Actually, in Senegal and Mali, where you get a concession for 15 years of operation, after these 15, or within these 15 years, you get a guarantee for non-grid connection, or if the grid comes, you get a good compensation for it. After these 15 years, all your assets are completely depreciated. Hopefully, you generated your margin that you expected. So whatever comes, you've done your job, the grid can come, everything else can be removed, that's it. So that is the first option you have to satisfy the mini-grid operator. Second option is, if you don't have any concessions, of course it makes a difference if you have a mini-grid installed which is compliant to the grid standards. If the regulatory authority or any other electrification authority in a country requires the mini-grid operator to install grids that are according to the national standards for distribution grids, then the grid can simply connect to the mini-grid technically, but how does it work financially? One option is you split the assets. The ownership of the grid stays with the national distribution grid company, or with a national authority, or with a local authority. Then the mini-grid operator can just take his movable generation assets and move out of the village. Install them somewhere else, just as Brian just introduced, or just sell them on a second-hand market. So this is an option. Usually some compensation for additional effort would be required to keep the mini-grid operator from realizing large losses. Another option would be to keep the mini-grid in the hands of the mini-grid operator once the main grid reaches the mini-grid. In that case, the mini-grid operator could just purchase electricity from the main grid and operate his assets, reducing, for example, diesel fuel consumption by using electricity from the main grid. The problem of that is that the mini-grid operator cannot rely on the unavailability of the main grid. As soon as the availability of the main grid improves, the economics of the mini-grid operator, well, he simply fails. He has to realize losses because he cannot use electricity generated from renewable sources, for example. Therefore, in that scenario, usually mini-grid operators would dismantle and sell their renewable energy assets and mainly run the mini-grid on the electricity from the national grid plus a certain portion of diesel fuel for periods of unavailability of grid. Then another option which goes along with that would be using the renewable energy assets to feed back to the main grid, or even a combined option where you still go on supplying your customers within your mini grid, purchase electricity from the main grid, and feedback access power to the main grid. So that would actually be an option which reduces the risk of a mini grid operator a little bit, but still is not sufficient to really convince them of using much of renewable power. So these options are existent.
And because we have a very engaged audience, a lot of you I know personally who have a lot of experience on the ground. So could I invite you, could ask questions, suggestions, observations, please.
Just a quick comment of what Navaraj has mentioned about grid connection of small systems. And you mentioned the difficulty in getting the grid connection because of technical reasons. And I fully appreciate that. It's on. Yeah, all right. I fully appreciate that because electricity utilities tend to be quite conservative, and then they are very possessive about their network, and they don't want to take any chances with that. But then there is a way out. Like what is done in most commercial installations, or rather for all commercial installations in other countries. Say, for example, I'm from Australia, and this issue had come up there. You have to install some additional protection systems. And mind you, these are not very costly things I'm talking about. These are quite reasonably priced, readily available, which are accepted by the utilities, So if you take care of connecting to the grid, using these protection systems, utilities normally don't object to that. So you mentioned about the backfeed. Well, I'm quite surprised to hear that that's a problem in your case, because that is no longer considered to be a problem. So anyway, so I think that is what, that same thing did come across in Australia 2-3 years back. The utilities just didn't believe it. But they got around to it. And they started accepting that. Now, there is another thing which I would like to bring up here, is that we are always assuming that we are sort of fighting with the utility. The utility will come and then we'll be out of the business. Well, okay, if you're talking about the existing technology or the technology which has been there for the last 10 years or maybe 15 years, maybe that's the case. But it doesn't have to be like that. I'll give you another example of how utility and renewable energy can go together. Like, for example, in Australia, there's quite a bit of tussle going on between the renewable energy promoters and the utilities, because utilities are thinking that they're eating up their business. And all sorts of barriers are coming in, preventing the renewable energy operators feeding power into the grid. But there is an exception. I come from the state of Western Australia, and there's a large area which is covered by Horizon Power, which is a government-owned utility. They generate the electricity at around 40 to 50 cents per kilowatt hour. They sell it at about 35 to 38 cents per kilowatt hour. So they lose money on every unit they sell. So they are perhaps one of the exceptions who are desperately looking for putting in more renewable energy into their system. But now here the problem comes. They have got small isolated grids, and the existing systems cannot feed power into these isolated grids safely because they can upset the grid. So there are technical problems. So solutions to these technical problems are being evolved, and they are helping. Now, I give this example because I think this situation will be applicable when you're talking about small isolated mini grids getting connected to the grid. I have started a mini grid. 5 years from now, the grid comes, and then I'm out of the business. It doesn't have to be like that. If you do it using the proper technologies right from the beginning, it's not going to cost you any more. You could still do it more or less at the same price, but you can protect your system, and when you get the power there, you should be able to operate it, and this can serve for boosting your grid, because when you're transmitting the power from somewhere to here, you're going in for line losses up to 25-30%. You are avoiding that. Your electricity cost is not going to remain the same. I'm not talking about subsidized cost, I'm talking about the real cost. And even today, it is quite possible, especially when you're talking about diesel-fed grid, to generate local electricity, which is cheaper than what your grid electricity is. So if you take the right technological options based on today's technology, you could surmount most of the problems which we are discussing about. I think we need to work with the utility rather than fight with the utility.
I think that's a very valid point, and that's something that needs to be built into the regulations from the start, that how do you make mini grid operators grid compliant? Ernesto and, okay, so we have to.
First, a comment. I don't think our great problem now is how we'll connect. Our problem is to install a lot of mini-grids. I think there are only a few mini-grids in the world, in reality. So our challenge is to install. We will see in the future. One of the arguments we have been using is that the mini-grids should be installed in those places where the grid is not now competitive. I wouldn't say it's not something to discuss, but in reality, I think it's not, under my point of view, the short-term problem. My question goes to Nico regarding, these mini-grids in Senegal, because I have some curiosity about the details of this financial scheme. Are they inside any of these concessions? The concessions, you said, are 15 years, but I saw some concessions that are for 25 years in Senegal. And which is the tariff and how it's financed, and how some details about the context of these concessions, please.
Yeah, well, our mini-grids are within the concessions. Actually, in Senegal, you cannot work without that. Although these concessions not completely reflect the original business model that we developed. Anyway, these concessions are for 15 years, and our financial model for the projects also runs for these 15 years, of course. The tariffs, as we have pretty small systems, some 20 kilowatt systems, mainly for 1,000 inhabitants village, tariffs are pretty high, and as I said, head management transaction costs are the major component in that. Tariffs are in the range of $1.40 per kilowatt hour, if you calculate that back to a kilowatt hour price. People are willing to pay for it. As Brian already said, it's not a problem for them, because anything else they could get, like kerosene, like diesel-generated electricity, like solar home systems, all of that is more expensive than what we can sell. So they are pretty happy with the price that we can provide, or with the electricity that we can provide. From a financial point of view, or from a finance point of view, let's say, we use some subsidies in our systems, which are between 30 and 45%. Then we've got some equity, of course, and we've got a certain debt or mezzanine portion. Well, we work together with development banks in that regard.
Yes, I'm Pramod Jain. Would like to just make a comment based on what Brian said. It just opened my eyes to situations where I guess no tariff, lack of regulations, lack of policy, just that vacuum helps to create a situation where private enterprise comes in and sort of takes care of the business. So the question is, to the panelists, are there situations where regulations, policies should just be unrolled, just taken away, and especially in situations like where you can have a RE type situation? The only argument I see is, well, what if the grid comes? We know it's not coming in a lot of places.
Well, I'll address on when the grid comes. So everybody talks about when the grid arrives, and the expectation is when the grid arrives, power will arrive. But that's not necessarily so. Our systems are compatible with grid connectivity, but what we found is we're a reliable supplement to that. So even where there's grid, there won't be power. So we expect that will still be an attractive supplementary option for our customers.
I guess just to add to that, there is a tendency to put very heavy-handed regulations, even though they're not realistic. So especially in this segment, I think it's very important for regulators to understand regulations are clearly important, especially if you're going to make mini grid operators grid compliant, so standards and stuff like that. But very heavy regulations or very process-driven regulations can completely kill this very new and emerging segment where entrepreneurs anyway have to work very hard and to make the last mile connectivity. So it just add to their efforts. So Hemant, you had something to say.
I'm Hemant Lamba from India. I have several layers of input and suggestions. One is on every decade of our energy excess, we walk on a fashion trend on a ramp. This decade is a ramp of mini grids. What we need to do at this point is, particularly in coming from India, mini grids using renewables have been invested almost 30 years in India through public investment. And there are almost 3,000 mini grids or probably more, which was invested by the government. And many of them are still working and many of them don't work. And there is now, since past few years, another trend which Brian is part of that community is in the private entrepreneurial space, the mini grids are coming. And there's a whole color and shade of that. I would count almost 2,000 of them have been set up. As a knowledge harvest, it's in that situation, there is a huge amount of knowledge which is existing, and this has not yet been harvested. So people who are in this room want to harvest that knowledge. India offers that possibility. The second level is opportunities, the possibilities. They are immense, particularly in Indian situation. If we see mini grids, there are almost 300,000 to 500,000 diesel mini grids already operational. The places they are operational, there are micro entrepreneurs who are running them. And the issue over there is financial exclusion and a gap of knowledge and the trust in the technology. So that's a kind of a low-hanging fruit which is hanging over there to be transitioned into a renewable mini grid. With certain policy changes, either bringing financial inclusion over there or bringing some kind of an aggregation to bring the renewable mini grids in form of lease or rentals or whatever forms of financial tools which can be made available to the people who are at the moment financially excluded. The second level of opportunity is actually in combining renewable energy with water grids. There are, in Indian situation, there are pumps which are run by one farmer and water is distributed to other farmers around. This is another form of a mini grid. And this offers a kind of a pumping mini grids to come in place using renewables. The third level is communities which giving them, allowing them, that is again coming on the regulation of side of it, and specifically in the small hydro segment, allowing the local community the first right to harvest the run of the river power, and if the community is not able to invest or is not enabled, at least give them a right to allow somebody on a revenue sharing basis to set up a system over there so that the community gets strengthened with certain revenue stream. And that can be done with biomass and that can be done with other technologies also. The last point which I would like to say is that one successful model in India for powering the large scale expansion of solar on-grid projects was a creation of an instrument of purchasing this power through a specific instrument called NVVN. And that, in a simplicity of it, they said we will buy so many billion kilowatt hours of solar power at this price and reverse bid it, and whichever who will be supplying cheapest would be eligible for that. A similar instrument, if we instrumentalize in mini grids, that there is a company or an buying so many billion kilowatt hours of mini grids, not only kilowatt hours, but how many houses have been energized or how many productive loads have been energized, also bundled into that. That can unblock a huge private sector, public investments into setting up mini grids.
I think we have just time for 2 more questions. I know that you had put up your hand and also Alok. So maybe in quick succession and then we can wrap up the session.
I'm Techi Capellan. I'm a developer of solar energy, and we do off-grid projects using mini-grid as the business model. And I'd just like to give a comment on what Nico has said, and also responding to the gentleman in front with regards to the policy. Nico mentioned about the 3 qualifications that would make investments go into those off-grid areas. And I think he identified basically concessionary rights, the tariffs, and villages. And if I would link that to the policy imperatives in terms of what governments can do to create this policy environment, for example, in concessionary rights, we would like to hear more of the other countries who have developed a structure to make developers be attractive to these areas. What are the samples? In the Philippines, we have what we call a qualified third party. It allows developers to enter into a concessionary space that is run by an existing utility company. But the procedure to get that, in fact, in spite of all of the off-grid areas in the Philippines, only 1 in the Philippines has qualified to be that qualified third party, if only to emphasize how difficult, how tedious it is to really apply for that concessionary right. And as most developers and investors know, concessionary rights is a very important tool in financing. So I think getting experiences from other countries of how to structure that concessionary right. Should it be 15 years? Should it be 20? Should it be 25? So those are, I think, the facets that I think you would like to hear as we do this conference. The second is the tariff setting. One of the important elements in the tariff setting is that most of our regulators are used to big size on-grid regulation. We are dealing with 30 kilowatt, 100 kilowatt systems. And these regulators cannot imagine how to regulate sizes of that size, generation of that size. So I think what we need from a policy point of view is a lot of technical assistance to our regulators to understand not only the challenges of size, but also of the integration of renewable energy into the system. Because what is happening is that if we do a diesel conventional system, they allow for a fixed cost and a variable cost. But when it comes to renewable, because they know that it is fixed and there are no fluctuations in the fuel cost, then the variable cost becomes a very critical element in their review of the tariff. And as we all know, there are a lot of variable costs when we go into an off-grid market. And that may not be the fuel fluctuations. That may be collection challenges. That may be several other administrative items. So from the policy point of view, I would suggest, some of the development banks to provide technical assistance to improve the capacity of our regulators to really learn tariff setting in an off-grid situation where you deal with smaller sizes, off-grids, and renewable integration. And then my last comment is into selecting villages. I think Nico was saying about the viability of those villages in terms of their capacity to pay. Here again, the challenge on the policy is to provide guarantees. It is not a subsidy, it's a simple and plain bank guarantee, so that when there is a failure of payment, when there is something like a disaster that hits the community or any force majeure, the developer is assured of a consistent and reliable tariff stream that would allow the developer to recover the costs that he invested into an off-grid setting. So I hope most of our panels can share with us more in their experiences in other countries of how these different challenges can be addressed so that other countries and other private entrepreneurs can learn from them. Thank you.
I think all very, very important points, and probably during the day we'll hear many more discussions around that. So let me just come to the last question. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Alok from DFID, India. I think we have been talking about scale for off-grid, and one of the solutions yesterday which was discussed to address this issue was demand aggregation. And so in that context, given some of the entrepreneurs who have worked with policymakers and regulators, do you think that they can play a major role in terms of aggregating demand, in those regions or something? For example, identifying certain regions where off-grid, like you kind of touched on that. But do you think a bigger role of policymakers or regulators in that, or you think that private players like you can yourself expand in that? So if you could give your views, that would be excellent.
Saying is whether the policy should enable aggregation.
Yes, that's.
So your transaction costs for any financial deals can be cut.
Yeah, maybe I can answer or comment on those two comments in one go. Actually, on the one hand, of course, the selection of a project site is a very complex task. You have to take so many things into consideration. When does the grid arrive? How far is it? What is the density of population? What is the village size? What is the capacity to pay? What is the potential for productive use development? What is the potential for consumptive use development? And many other things. These questions are always the same for more or less all the mid-sized mini-grid developers and mini-grid operators. Of course, you could leave this task to select the village to the mini-grid operator, but that could also be a task for an authority, because it's always the same questions. At the end, of course, there are some mini-grid operators which prefer some villages above others. But if you show this data transparently, it's very easy for the project developer to select his ideal village. Regarding the transparency and how other regulatory authorities and countries work with tariff settings, actually we're working with partners, or we're involved in 2 different projects right now which tackle this a little bit. The one is the mini-grid policy toolkit, which Rana already suggested or introduced, where we introduce strategies and especially, well, we do not give recommendations actually, but we explain what policy has got which effects and what tariff setting regulation has got which effects. So this is this mini-grid policy toolkit, which will probably be available in autumn this year. A second project that we are involved in is with GIZ in India and Uttar Pradesh, where we are trying to take the project development burden off the shoulders of mini-grid operators, where we try to prepare projects where we bundle actually villages into clusters and prepare the projects up to a stage where the mini-grid operator can take over, reducing his transaction cost to the minimum possible, which will hopefully enable a lot of mini-grid operators to jump into this business more quickly and to break even more quickly. So that is actually the challenge. How, like as a mini grid operator, how can you scale up quickly to break even, to reduce the percentage of your head management and transaction costs on your tariff, or your electricity tariff, to make sure that with the tariff that you collect, you're profitable. So these two projects, I think, go into this direction, but of course, they are not exhausting, and there are probably much more projects required to get into the direction that you just requested for.
So I think I know that I have my colleague who's waving his hands to tell me that we've overrun and overshot our time. And but let me just say that it's been an extremely interesting discussion, having great panelists with me, and I'd like to thank all of you, and of course a very engaging audience that I guess motivated the panelists to give their best and into the discussion. So just on this note, that having a policy framework that not just promotes deployment, but also enables various business models to flourish and to access finance, as well as creates a level playing field, is what all of us are looking for. And hopefully many more mini grids to come, and when we maybe sit in a session like this next year, we'll have exponentially increased the mini grids on the ground. So thank you very much.